Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here for Grand Rounds. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker to you this afternoon. It's Dr. Peter Yu, who is the physician-in-chief of Hartford HealthCare Cancer Institute in Hartford, Connecticut. Peter is also a member of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and as most of you probably know, Peter served as a past president of ASCO. So Peter has agreed to come and give a talk about cancer informatics, and we're looking forward to his presentation, and then meet with some of us to discuss opportunities for collaborations between the systems. So thank you so much, Peter, for being here.
Yes. Thank you, Rogerio. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me here. And I probably should have thought of a more exciting title than Cancer Informatics, but I was kind of tired, so I just put it down. But it's kind of an odd thing, Cancer Informatics. You know, thinking about it, it's similar, I think, in many ways to oncology, the way the world views as oncology. I mean, either you look at it and you shriek and run away because of the complexity of oncology and it's too much to get your handle on, or else you kind of embrace the complexity and say, I really want to understand this beast. And I think informatics is pretty much the same way. You can run away and scream, or you could actually be curious to know actually what's going on behind it and what are the possibilities. And one thing I've learned is you don't really need to understand how to write code or do really geeky things. But I think it's important to understand that someone out there knows how to do that kind of stuff, and how this can be useful for what you do, whether it's taking care of patients or doing some form of research. So why digital health? You know, it's a bit of a rhetorical question, but you know, reasonable. Well, there are three stakeholders or groups where digital health is important and means something different to each one of those three. So it's worth calling out. Certainly there are patients who are the direct beneficiaries of healthcare, and in our world increasingly need to be participating in that. We have the providers, which include physicians, nurses, advanced practice nurses, pharmacists, and the healthcare systems that they increasingly belong to as we get into more systems medicine, and research. So if we drill down a little bit deeper into that, for patients in our current climate, we are really encouraged to bring patients into healthcare as patient-centered care. And so patients need to have access to their data, but they really need access to education about what that data means. So that's one aspect of digital health. And it also means moving away from electronic health records and more into mobile health. So that's the first lesson, is that digital health does not mean the electronic health record. That's one component of the electronic health record, but we need to think beyond that. For providers and healthcare systems, we are increasingly entering a value-based medicine world. That means we need to think about the outcomes that our patients have and have some way of measuring that we are in fact improving outcomes. It also means that we need to look at the efficiency or the processes of care to understand the variation in care and how we can reduce costs and improve outcomes. And that's a clear big need for digital health, something we didn't have to do in the past now but need to grapple with. And then research, which is both the translational research in the oncology world, the genomics and genetics of cancer, which is vital to our drug development and discovery, as well as population health. And those are two very different kinds of research, different kinds of data. So that's the framework that I'm going to work on today to try to explain some of the things that are going on in the United States with this area. Another way of looking at, that I find useful, another way of looking at informatics is to think about the flow of data as it comes through the system. So the first step is data aggregation, which is obviously means just getting the data together and the different kinds of data that are important understanding what the meaning of that data is and using it correctly. Once you have and I would say the data aggregation is probably the worst part of this whole process. I mean, that's the most painful part. This is the part that requires a lot of clicking and data entry and taking up a lot of the doctor's time. And we hear a lot of how doctors are not looking at the patients anymore, they're looking at the screen. And doctors are being up at 2 in the morning, finishing their notes, and all these things are very true. And we also hear about the millions and millions of dollars being spent for big healthcare systems, data systems, and that's all true, painful, necessary, and if you don't do it right, nothing else flows out of it. But it's everything to the right that you begin to unleash the value, and that's really where we need to be thinking about. So if you had that data together, you had the data you need, you could begin to run analytics on that and understand your data. And I'm increasingly appreciating that actually, even though this is flowing left to right, really the analytics really have a lot to do with what kind of data you pull together. Because you can't just collect every piece of data. And if you know the questions you're going to ask and the analytics you want to run, you can concentrate on what data you need to have. So data aggregation, data analytics, connected, bidirectional. If you have that, you can then begin to ask interesting questions which impact patient care and population health and research, and that's knowledge generation. So now you got to the third step. And then the final step is really figuring out what you're going to do with that new knowledge to actually improve outcomes or drive research questions. So that's the continuum. And there are a lot of problems with each one of those steps. So I'm going to go through some of the common problems that we encounter with each step. And the first is data aggregation challenges. So we have a problem that most of our data comes out of the electronic health record. And the electronic health record is organized by individual patients. Now, actually, that's an improvement because in the days of paper charts, every doctor had their own medical record for every individual patient, and it was even more difficult. At least now with the informatics, we, by and large, can link all the patients into one medical record, an electronic record. But it's still individualized by patient, which means it's hard to do population health. It's hard to aggregate the data across similar patients and bring them together in a view that you can understand. Form should follow function. What I mean by that is what I said earlier, that the function is the analytics. So how the data is put in should have some bearing to what analytics you want to run. And we don't do that right now. We just put the data in. And we put the data in largely because our reimbursement system defines what data is important. And this goes back to the 1980s and Dr. Schall's relative value unit system, where doctors were paid for entering social history, family history, number of view systems, and that's really forced the data to go in that direction. It also uncovers another characteristic of informatics, which is that it tends to be driven by primary care needs rather than specialty care needs. And so that's another problem that we have with our data structure. The really interesting part of data is in the narrative text. If I had my way, we wouldn't really spend a whole lot of time talking about allergies and medications. It suffices that it's somewhere in the medical record. You don't actually need to, spend time documenting it in the chart for billing purposes. What I really want to know for something in oncology is what the physician or the provider is actually thinking. What's the cognitive aspects? And we're not paid for cognitive work, but really that's what we do. And that kind of information is in narrative text or free text. It's not on click and point fields, which vendors often try to make you do notes that way, but it really just doesn't work in oncology. So understanding the concept behind the narrative text is a challenge. The data that we want is often hard to find. It's not always there. It's variably captured. That's a quality issue. There is a lot of data that is outside the electronic health records and pathology systems and radiation oncology systems. So that needs to be brought together. And all that would help us achieve interoperability, which is the exchange of data, which requires technical capability to transfer data back and forth from different software systems and repositories, some governance process, and purpose, because interoperability is not simply exchanging data. It's really properly exchanging data between two parties who have agreed to share that data for a common purpose. And then they're really working together. And if you're just devising pipelines to transfer data without understanding what the purpose of that exchange is, it's really hard to achieve interoperability. Data analytic challenges, well, there are multiple data sources and types. So do you have all the data that you want to have? Probably it's not all in one place. You have to go search and find out where that other data exists and then link it together. Right now, that takes weeks. You know, if you go to an analyst and ask them for data, you have to tell them where the data resides. They have to go to different departments, get permission. But if you had that all electronically identified and captured, you could do these reports in seconds rather than weeks. So the data sources and access to them is a real problem. Narrative text, I mentioned the problem that the really interesting stuff is often written in English. And it's hard to understand or extract that. And I was at Memorial Sloan Kettering last week talking to some of the informatics people, and they have a development of natural language processing. So natural language processing is this capability to look at free text and pull out the semantic concepts. And it's greatly overrated in terms of its capability. So that's, I want to say that up front. But it was interesting. They were applying natural language processing at Memorial to look at clinical trials, to understand what the trial was and how to match patients to that. And so they had a trial whose title was something like second-line therapy of adenocarcinoma of the lung after erlotinib. And because of the way they structured their semantics, they were able to realize this was probably an EGFR-related study, and then categorize it as such. So that ability to understand in the computer what certain phrases mean and what the relationship is with a set of words to a concept, which is called an ontology, is critical for understanding data. And we don't have good ontologies in oncology. And that's a major issue. Enterprise data management just refers to the ability to bring all this data together in one accessible, often called a data warehouse or a data mart. So building a enterprise system to handle your data is something that most systems do not have. And then you need the analysts, and everybody has their own analysts, if you're lucky. Often the analysts will ask, if you ask the analyst for a question, they'll go around figuring out how to solve that question, but they may do it differently than another analyst. And so lacking standards of measures and metrics means that you may not be able to compare your analysis with, say, another healthcare system, because you're really not comparing the same thing. So this lack of standard measures and metrics, which professional societies and organizations like the American College of Surgeons and ASCO are spending time trying to develop that. And then there are knowledge generation challenges. That was the third step. How do you understand the data? How do you draw inferences? I would put an example of precision medicine, the problem with variant calls. So as we're getting more and more into genomic sequencing and finding variants, being able to understand which variants are pathogenic, which variants actually match to a disease is a challenge. And then value-based care, understanding what we're doing. Is it adding value? Is it improving outcomes? Does it have any clinical utility, which means is it worth doing or not? And access to these knowledge bases. So some of these are proprietary, which means that they may not be public, and that's not a good thing. And then application challenges. We really haven't learned how to use these tools, but molecular tumor boards, being able to do clinical trials matching, as I referred to the example with the EGFR mutated lung cancer study, understanding your variation in the value-based medicine world, clinical decision support and patient engagement. These are uncharted territories. And so what I'm going to do now is give you some examples of things that are being done around the country, around the world, to try to address some of those issues, to give you a flavor of what is possible. So in the precision medicine world, and now I'm asking you to take a step back from oncology and imagine you're not an oncologist or someone working in the cancer field, you're just dealing with human diseases of all sorts. And so in that world, they tend to think of more genetic or inherited diseases rather than somatic diseases, which is largely what cancer is. But having said that, if you went to the databases and said how many inherited diseases are there that have no known genetic cause, it numbers over 3,000. And then if you went to another database, or knowledge base, I've talked about knowledge bases, so these are public knowledge bases. If you went to the NIH ClinVar knowledge base and asked how many mutations are there in the NIH data set for which there's no clear answer about whether this is actually something that causes disease or is just a polymorphism, there are over 66,000. So yes, we're doing a lot of sequencing and getting a lot of data, but we really, at this point, don't know how to tie those two together to bring the diseases and the drivers together. So I mentioned ClinVar, which is the NIH knowledge base. And how is that constructed? This has been done just over the last couple of years, so many of you may not have heard about this, or maybe you have, but if you bear with me, you have. The idea is that as variants are found through laboratory tests and sequencing, that the various sources of this data will contribute that data into ClinVar. So it could be clinical labs, it could be patients, it could be physicians or researchers. But when they encounter a variant that they have not seen before or are not sure what it means, they report it to the NIH into the ClinVar database. The ClinVar database then looks into some other known public source knowledge bases to verify whether anything is known about that or not. And if it is, then it pulls that data in. But more likely, there isn't much there. And so the NIH has stood up a variety of working groups. Two of them are cancer. One is hereditary or genetics, and one is somatic cancers or genomics. And these experts in cardiovascular disease and other disease types will, as an expert opinion, if you will, look at these variants, use their combined knowledge to try to categorize these variants to say, what do we know about the literature? What is in the literature? How good is the research? Can we trust it? What level of evidence supports a clinical annotation to a variant? And then that goes back into ClinVar, which is then becomes the publicly available tool. So I had a patient who was about 40 years old, and he had had 2 colon cancers already. And so, of course, I sequenced him for Lynch syndrome, and the commercial lab I sent to said it's a variant of unknown significance. And I waited a few years and kept on asking, and they kept on saying, we haven't categorized it yet. And so when ClinVar came along, I had this mutation there, and so I just typed it in to see what ClinVar would tell me about this VUS. And it returned this, and this is the way the report looks like. It says that, yes, this has been reviewed by an expert panel, and they have 3 stars, which is an indicator of their confidence in how good they think the evidence is on their call. And their call was that this was a pathogenic mutation. So that answered a question that I clinically had assumed, but really was trying to struggle with why it didn't show that. It tells you that it is, in fact, associated with Lynch syndrome. And then interestingly, and this is where it crosses over into the research world, it gives you a reference to the University of California Santa Cruz database. So UC Santa Cruz, for some of you may not know, is really one of the computational biology genomic hubs. It was the hub for the Cancer Genome Atlas project, for example. And so if you click on that link, that brings you to the UC Santa Cruz site, which maps the mutation to chromosome 3 and gives you more detail. And then interesting, if you look down here, it gives you a comparison to mice, dog, elephants, zebrafish, and a bunch of other things. So why do you want to know that? What it really is doing is telling you there's a model out there that exists in some experimental animal model. And these are slides from the Monarch group showing the possibility of looking at animal data to understand human models. So if you think about the Mendelian diseases, they estimate only about 20% of diseases that are thought to be inherited in humans have actually been linked to a genetic mutation. But if you ask the question, is there a mice or model or zebrafish model that has some similar phenotypic or clinical disease characteristics, and does that have a match to a known mutation, potentially 80% of human diseases could be covered by either what we know or some animal model that could be studied. And these are some of the groups of the Monarch Initiative. And I point this out because the other concept I want to bring out today is something called an ecosystem. So for data really to be useful and cancer informatics to be really useful, it really requires partnership with organizations around the world with different focuses. Some may be patient-oriented, some may be research, some may be animal research. But bringing that ecosystem together and achieving that interoperability of data, that sharing of data for a common purpose, is a powerful concept for cancer informatics. However, when I was at the Monarch meeting a couple weeks ago, and it struck me that these were mostly people involved in Mendelian diseases and inherited diseases. And so they're pretty much in a one disease, it has one mutation, and every patient there's one mutation kind of model. And that doesn't really hold true for cancer diseases. It may be true for things like Huntington's disease, but in the cancer world where we have somatic mutations, that's not quite a good model. Even with germline mutations, they may show predisposition, but they aren't the only driver of the cancer. If you think about the things oncologists deal with, like acquired drug resistance, that's certainly not one disease, one mutation model, or for acquired clinical aggressiveness, so metastatic potential, attributes like that. So in the oncology world, we have much greater complexity than in the Mendelian world, and we need to map these mutations to cancer behavior. So as we are doing liquid biopsies and seeing evolution in the genomics of the cancer, we need to understand not only which are the original genomic mutations, but which of these acquired mutations are background noise and which one actually tell us something about the behavior of the cancer, whether it's resistance or aggressiveness. And you think about it, there are many causes of drug resistance. You could have a secondary mutation, like you might see in BCR-ABL, that becomes resistant to the targeted therapy. You could have clonal selection of a pre-existing resistant strain. It may be through epigenetic regulations. There could be pathway downstream to where the original mutation was that reactivates the pathway, crosstalk between pathways, other signal pathways, and mutations that drive metastatic behavior beyond simply growth. And so if thinking about that, I was thinking, well, what do we mean by cancer resistance? And I just made this up about a week or two ago. So this is just as I'm thinking through the sound. Well, we could say there's those who didn't respond, de novo resistance, and that might be one type of resistance. There are patients who progress after response, and that's a different mechanisms that are probably coming into play. Then you have patients who have what I call accelerated malignant behavior, faster growth or spread, clinical spread. And the most, I think, obvious example is spread to the CNS, which often we don't see early in the course of diseases, but comes on later. And then if you think about that, well, what does CNS mutation means? Well, it could be from bone directly into duro from the skull. It could be leptomeningeal. It could be actually in the cerebellar cortex. You could probably throw paraneoplastic syndromes there if you want. And so what I'm starting to describe here is the beginning of what's called an ontology, which is categorizing words and descriptors in a way that you can begin to understand a clinical question. So, just a little time check. So, let's leave that aside and let's go on to the problem of data and having incomplete data, having data that's not entered correctly, or data that's not searchable. So, the College of American Pathologists, as you probably all know, has long designed cancer checklists. So, these are standards that they have created by pathologists for 81 different cancer types. And they said if you are a pathologist describing a cancer of this organ site, this is the data you have to describe in your report. Size, margins, grade, whatever it might be. And occasionally now more and more some biomarkers as well. The College of American Pathologists has been doing this for years. The American College of Surgeons requires that if a hospital wants to be certified by the Commission on Cancer as a cancer center, it needs to follow the CAP guidelines. So that's all well and good, but this was done in a paper world. And the result was that the pathologists had not specified how it was supposed to be reported, in what manner, and in a searchable field. And so CAP several years ago, and ASCO asked ASCO to help with this, began this process of making it more granular and specific about what they meant with their requirements. And this is something that all systems now are being forced to do. So I also work with AJCC, and they just released the 8th edition, and it's increasingly more attention to being very, very specific about what you mean when you state that this is how it should be done. So the current requirements in the paper world just said that you had to put this information somewhere in your report. And so highlighted, in yellow is someone has had to go through this, read it out, and then find, oh, there's the size, it's over there. So technically it met the American College of Surgeons standards, but it wasn't very helpful for data extraction. On the other hand, if you had a synoptic report where you would specify, okay, every descriptor will be in a specific place, and the measurements will be done in centimeters or millimeters or whatever, this would be much easier to read and much more likely to be complete, and also the data could be extractable. So the College of American Pathologists began this process of developing electronic checklists. And for those who are a little more interested in informatics, these are the attributes they wanted to hit on. So they wanted version control so that everybody would have the same version and not be changing it. They wanted to be in a manner that data could be exchanged using XML format, so this data could go to other places like cancer registries, so the data could move around. They wanted to use standard coding that already exists, like ICD-03 and SNOMED, so that the terminology would be specific and everybody would know what that term meant. And this would allow data mining and data transmission. So this is a very important project that CAP has embraced. And this is a screenshot of what it looks like in the software system. So if you're a pathologist and you're entering whether there's a PIK3 mutation, all you need to do is hit a radio button, and then it shows up, no mutations detected. And you can see various mutations have been put into this place. And then also, this gives you an example of what it would look like to the user who actually enters the software system. You would see a pretty clean look for mismatch repair and protein expression for the various genomic changes associated with this. So it's both cleaner and easier for the physician to read and use, and also does it in a way that is extractable. So the California Cancer Registry began looking at this, and I moved here from California a few months ago, so I was part of this work, began saying, we really want to start getting data into the cancer registries, the state registries, in a consistent, standard fashion. And as you know, the cancer registries, every state has one. They report to SEER, or at least some of them do. So about 28% of the U.S. population is reported to the SEER database, which is an NCI database for research use. But 100% of state registries report to the CDC. And so there are, this rolls up into national level data at some point. So in California, we said, we need to get data in cleanly. Right now, the present state, for example, in California, half of the reports that the Department of Health receives that are purported to be cancer actually are not cancer. They have the word cancer somewhere in the report, and it gets sent in there. And this is what happens when you have unfunded mandates. You tell all the hospitals and pathology departments you must report cancer cases or something bad will happen, so they, rather than risk missing something, they just send everything. So half of the reports coming into California are not cancer, and the Department of Health spends a lot of time just reading through that before they can get to any useful data. So they really like the idea of having data coming directly from the pathologist's electronic health record system, and began to build upon that. There actually is now a state law that was signed last year that says by 2019, all cancer pathology data in California must be reported in some digital format by 2019. And so our group began actually saying, well, it's one thing to pass a law and says everybody has to do it, but how do you do it? So that's called an implementation guide. So now we're working to specify the various ways that pathologists could electronically transmit this data. We would prefer they use the CAP ECC system, but but any form of electronic transmission is a breakthrough. So we're trying to be more inclusive of that. So this is from the Department of Health, the California Cancer Registry, and their concepts is, well, if you had real-time cancer data, that would be nice, because right now it can take 6 months or more for them to find out there's a cancer case. But if the pathologist, the minute the pathologist makes a diagnosis, it's sent electronically, you would know in real time. That would be a big improvement. If it's interoperable, that would be better. Everybody could share the data. The Cancer Registry is already a patient-centric data model. That is, it collects data from all the hospitals and providers in the state of California. So whether the patient had surgery at one hospital and radiation at another hospital, that information can be drawn into a single source of truth. And so the idea was to let's drive that and have that data really in a usable manner. And then we could do decision support systems and applications that I talked about as the fourth progression of the use of data. And this is a law that was passed requiring a transmission of pathology information. And so I also talked about an ecosystem. So the California Department of Health is conceptually thinking that if they're collecting all the data on a cancer patient in the state, that could start with diagnostic data, and so that's the pathology data, but also could include imaging and biomarkers as they're added. It is collecting some information already on treatment, on radiation, chemotherapy, and surgery treatment. This could be increased more robustly with data interoperability. They have some data available in the state from the Medicaid system called Medi-Cal, but they could add more billing information, connections to patients, and really their view is the California Cancer Registry could become a single source of truth for quality of care and research. It's a big lift, I agree. But the concept is that people are thinking about data now as where does it all come from, how can we move it around, how can we make it publicly available for use. I'll skip this one. That was an example of the FDA system, but we're going to move on. Patients, I mentioned that we have to increasingly bring patients into the picture, have them provide, not only have them educate and understand their data, but actually donate data or give their data. Because very often they are in a better position to tell us what's going on with themselves, and it also, frankly, takes the work off of you. So you don't have to necessarily enter the pain level. The patient can enter the pain level. Then you would have it there and you would save some work. So why not have the patients be part of the system? And that really is increasingly going to involve mobile health. So this was a really interesting study that was presented at ASCO last year in lung cancer. It came from France, from Dr. Dennis. And the question was, if you have patients who have early stage lung cancer, potentially curable, but did require chemotherapy or some treatment, and they finish their treatment, and now they're being observed, right? That's what doctors do. They bring the patient back every 3 months, they ask them how they're doing, they get a CT scan every 4 months or whatever it is, and they just wait for something bad to happen and hope they catch it in time. That's sort of our current workflow. And they asked the question, well, what happens in between those 3-month visits and those 4-month CT scans? Can the patients tell us what's going on and really alert us to what's happening a month or two earlier? And would that make any difference? And so they had they designed a randomized clinical trial, basically. They had done some nifty, I think, preliminary work. They had constructed a mobile app that allowed patients to enter 12 symptoms. And in this clinical trial, the patient would access their mobile device and on a weekly basis report their 12 symptoms, how they were doing, their energy level, things of that nature. And if the reports suggested there was something untoward happening, emails would be sent to the providers, and providers would be notified to call the patient early, do an evaluation. And so the study was set up, and it doesn't project as well as I would like, so that in the control arm, patients would have CT scans on a fairly frequent basis, every 3 months, every 4 months, depending on the stage. But in the experimental arm with the patient reporting every week how they were doing, there were far fewer scans that were ordered. And the question was, did that make a difference? And interestingly, this is the actual survival curve, and the patients who were on the web application arm, the mobile arm, had superior survival to the patients who were just followed routinely. Now, these patients all were seen on the same physician intervals. The only thing difference was the number of CT scans that were done. And there was a marked difference in that. There also was a marked difference in cost, obviously. If you're doing fewer CT scans, it's going to cost you less. So they had reduced the cost. The patients had better outcomes. You know, why this was better? Their speculation was maybe the patients were able to go on to treatment sooner. They did look at the performance status at diagnosis of recurrence. The performance status was superior in patients who were on the web application arm, suggesting they were finding the patient's cancer recurrence earlier and were better able to deliver therapy, but that part is speculation. So I've been at Hartford about 9 months now. And so when I arrived there, one of my first questions was, you know, what are you guys doing here for digital health and information? And they said, well, you know, we used to be on, you know, we were 5 hospitals. We came together the last few years to create this system. We had 4 different EHRs, so we're now transitioning to Epic, you know, which you are on as well. So they're moving towards one electronic health record standard. I asked them about their pathology, and they said, we've gone on to a new Sunquist CoPath system. I said, well, does it support, you know, the CAP electronic checklist? They said, yes, but we haven't turned it on. So I said, okay, we'll turn it on for you. So we're paying the money to have that brought up to speed so we can get the digital pathology reports. The radiation systems, they've consolidated into the one Mosaic system, software for radiation across the sites. They had 5 cancer registries for 5 hospitals. They've now moved it, in the process of moving it to one cancer registry software system. The clinical trials system is new software. I'm just giving you examples of the things that I'm sure you have too, but these are different cancer data repositories. A vendor-neutral archive system for imaging has been put into place. They have contracted with a provider to do mobile health, so we're beginning to explore with them how we might use that in the oncology space. They contracted with a analytic software system for genomic health to begin to analyze that, and so that's been brought in. And together, what I told them we really should think about doing is creating a enterprise data warehouse or data mart for oncology where we link all these software systems and have them interoperable. So that's what we're embarking upon now. Now, this is important for bringing data or increasing data liquidity within the system, but it's also important that we talk to our external world. We have a relationship with Memorial Sloan Kettering around clinical trials and other quality efforts, so there's going to be a need to exchange information with MSK, and yesterday we had the first meeting of our Informatics subcommittee to talk about how we're going to be exchanging data in the MSK Cancer Alliance. There's already need to transfer data to registries. Some of these are state registries, national registries like SEER, but also ASCO's COPI, Quality Improvement Project. There's need to exchange data with other providers who are not in our healthcare system, but are taking care of patients that we share. Communication with patients directly, and increasing this larger ecosystem. I put up here the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, which I'll describe later, but it's an international consortium designed to exchange health information around the world with a particular emphasis on informatics and genomics. And then others, payers want information, Food and Drug Administration, in that slide I skipped over, but the FDA was there. And this is what we call real-world evidence. So besides the evidence that we extract from clinical trials, there's a huge amount of data that on patients who are not in clinical trials called real-world evidence. And there are a lot of people very interested in understanding that. So what we really need is ecosystems. Doing good on time. So I'm going to give you some examples of ecosystems I find particularly interesting. I mentioned the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. We actually got the good news last week that perspective piece that we wrote is accepted in the England Journal of Medicine, so that should be coming out soon. But the Global Alliance, basically the concept was We have across the world various health systems, primarily genomic, researchers in the genomic space, who are not connected. And the Global Alliance was formed to first create these social networks of like-minded people who have a common purpose, the definition of interoperability, to help these different entities identify people around the world who they may want to interact with and share data with. And the other was then to create a framework to allow that not only for groups to identify each other, but to actually begin to exchange data. And this is international, so we had to do work on privacy and security and ethical standards, not just in the United States, but in Europe, Australia, all around the world. And then creating application program interfaces, or APIs, which are a fast and cheap way of connecting systems together without a lot of expense. And so the Global Alliance has been working with that framework. It stood up a couple of projects. One is the BRCA challenge. And so the question there was very specific. Everybody's coming up with new variants within BRCA 1 and 2. We don't know really if those are pathogenic or not. So how can we speed that knowledge transfer back and forth? So this allows people who are interested in uncovering new BRCA mutations to exchange their information so they can categorize faster, more quickly, whether it is a pathogenic variant they found or just a polymorphism. Another one that I'm going to show on the next slide is called the Matchmaker Exchange. And the concept here, and this is, again, this is all human diseases, but it starts over here where a researcher, a clinician, identifies a patient and wonders, has anybody else seen anything like this before? So this is the conceptual model, but it actually is stood up already. And so with these application program interfaces and informatics tools, one can construct a report of my patient, the clinical or phenotypic characteristics, as well as the genomic findings, and then send that out into the Matchmaker Exchange. That, as a query, goes to a variety of sites. And if one of the sites says, our data shows that we have a similar patient, that a similar report can be generated and sent back, and now these two sites are connected and can begin to work together. The fourth site is not humans. These are animal models, and this is the Monarch Exchange I showed earlier. So someone perhaps says, that maps to a mice model that we have that shows a similar disease. Maybe it's a useful model for your research, maybe not, but here's the information. And again, these two could begin to collaborate. So that's an example of a powerful ecosystem. In the United States, you're probably aware of the ORIEN network, and these are slides from Bill Dalton, which is a research network coming together to really look at clinical research and translational research, bringing together a variety of cancer centers you see on the left to speed discovery through data sharing, looking at biomarker-driven clinical trials, and developing an evidence base to support clinical decision-making. Many of the goals I said in the beginning in that fourth slide, the fourth transition of data. And so they are collecting tissue specimens on all these patients from these institutions. They're doing sequencing, and they're adding the clinical data and longitudinal clinical data, which is not just a snapshot in time of what happened to this patient, but what happened to the patient during the course of their treatment and treatment evolution. So a very large data set. This requires informatics. They started building this early on using an Oracle data warehouse to structure their data and to allow them to then achieve these goals. So you have the source of the data, you have the data warehouse where the data is housed, and then you can then drive to the applications that you want to have. And in their long-term view, they're looking at the ecosystem, just like other things I said before, connecting patients, connecting research, connecting hospitals, bringing it together within this network to share fully robust data. Another example that you've probably heard of is in Europe. It's being centered at the University of Heidelberg, creating a data warehouse for oncology. This is more for pure research purposes. Their system underlies a network they've created within Germany because of stringent privacy rules. There are things they can do within Germany, but going across international borders constrain them. So they had to build one network centered around Heidelberg in Germany, and then Christoph Oncology then helped power this organization, which links all these institutions throughout Europe. And then finally, there's CancerLinQ, which is ASCO's version. So I have to spend a few words talking about that. ASCO thought a few years ago that we should look at big data, and we would take one part of this challenge. The challenge was electronic health records. We would work on that function since our members all have electronic health records now. There's cancer data there now. We're already telling them about data requirements for things like COPI and other reasons. And so we should begin to try to make the technical capability of bringing that data, aggregating it, making sense, and harmonizing it across the system. And that's really what CancerLinQ is. Quick snapshot where we are right now. There are about 80, we call them practices that signed up. The practices includes Intermountain Health, and includes Vanderbilt University. Practices can be as small as 3 or 4 doctors, but it also goes to large healthcare systems. And we have 80 that are signed up, but more important to me, we actually have 40 of these clinical sites where data is actually flowing. So it takes time to hook it up and bring the data in. But we have 40 practices with data coming in. They represent 1,200 oncologists. There are about 13,000 medical oncologists in the United States, so that's about 10%. We have about 1 million patient records at this point, and it's a variety of electronic health record systems, so it's not just 1 or 2. And that's really quite difficult because every system is different, but we have 9 different ones. The concept is to create 2 databases. One is a we call it clinical database. It's identified data. There are certain uses where you need to know which patient this is. So if it's a decision support tool, the information is flowing from the practice into CancerLinQ, and CancerLinQ fires off a decision support tool with a suggestion. We have to know who that patient is because we have to return that back to the provider and the patient. So some data is identified, and the practice itself may want to analyze the data. So we preserve that ability. But beyond that, we take the data from different providers, strip out the patient identifiers, aggregate that data. Now we have a large analytical database that can be used for research purposes. And so there's this dual functionality. This is just a pictorial of it. Practices sending their data in to CancerLinQ. The data is then mapped and harmonized so that we understand what it is. You can overlay these tools like a common patient index, ontologies I described briefly earlier, creating this database identified, but also per HIPAA standards, de-identified so that it's available for the research world. And that, in a nutshell, is CancerLinQ. So I'm just going to close, I think, with the last 3 slides to say that there is a lot of data out there that is not being used because of the problems I said earlier on, the fact that it's inconsistent, it's not structured, it's not understood. Some of it is in the private patient level or individual healthcare system. Increasingly, more and more of it, though, is in the public domain. And the ability to use both types of data, understand what's available for public use, is a critical part for developing a cancer information architecture. This is a slide I just discovered last week. It's very interesting. It looks at who's doing what in this cancer ecosystem right now, and how do you map it. And it mapped it among, on the top part are knowledge bases or information systems that are available in the public domain. You'll see here some of the NCI stuff. The Global Alliance, the Matchmaker Exchange, and the BRCA identification I talked about is all public information. Anything, of course, in the NIH is public, in Project Genie, for example. That's on this axis. On the x-axis, it's whether this is data in just a snapshot of the patient at one point in time, which gives you some information, or whether it's giving you longitudinal data, which gives you more richer information about outcomes. And so you start to see more the healthcare systems like Geisinger over here, and Kaiser over here, and CancerLinQ over here. The size of the circles tells you the amount of data that's available in there. So there are a lot of systems forming out there. I mean, it's like constellations forming in the sky. And it's interesting to see who's doing what and how they're going about doing that. This is the last slide. Another way of looking at it, which is maybe a little simpler in my mind, is I think about where does data come from? And I think about, is it genomic data or is it patient data sources? So patient data sources, electronic health records, patients directly, devices or Internet of Things, laboratories. These are generators of patient data. There are data coming from the Cancer Genome Atlas and other projects that are more coming out of the research realm. Increasingly, data is being aggregated by organizations that I showed you on the earlier slide that are beginning to pull the data for specific research purposes in here or more clinical purposes down here. And we need to increasingly think, how does the data flow up and down and back and forth? And particularly for translational research, I think this is where the real money is. These research networks that have done the heavy lift of bringing groups together, of collecting data, of harmonizing and standardizing it so it's understandable. This is where useful data exchange, I think, really can go and lead to interoperability of data. So that's my last slide. And I'm happy to take questions or end early.
For one or two questions. Yes, let me bring you the microphone.
You're on a tumor board and you have to make decisions in real time of whether to walk out there and schedule your patient for radiotherapy or surgery. How does this system, or can it, help you make that type of decision?
There are a variety of ways you could do it. I mean, you could imagine first just access to a knowledge base. So the question comes up, and you know, right now on a tumor board, you're kind of dependent on the knowledge held with, you know, in the brain of every person there, right? But if you had, you know, a digital source of information, you could not, it wouldn't just be what I happen to remember what I read last week, but, you know, more of a stand-up. So if you have these curated knowledge bases like ClinVar or Clin, you know, that tell you this mutation supports this with, you know, this linkage with this evidence, level of evidence, you know, you could make a decision, you know, much quicker. So having access to that knowledge in real time, I think, is you know, the most obvious area. Others are, you know, just standards of care. You know, there are so many standards of care now from organizations, and they're peer-reviewed and they're accepted as standards, but often you may not know what that exists. So access to those standards of care, being able to link the patient, you know, to that data directly, so it extracts that relevant data for you, so you don't have to go searching. You know, automating that process would be very interesting. You know, it's I got an email as I walked in here from Epic, because I had sent an email to them last month saying, you know, what are you doing with genomics? And the answer was, well, we're just, you know, it's interesting. We're just starting up a group about that. We're looking for someone to work with an Epic engineer. You know, do you want to do that? So, you know, you have to be careful what you ask for. So, of course, I had to say yes. So the email I got just before I came in here was from one of their Epic engineers saying, okay, you know, let's get together and talk about it. I'd like to tell you what our plans are for genomics and through Epic. So you know, I'm very cautious about what that means, and, you know, but still, I think, you know, that's what we have to think about. How do we use these tools? And increasingly, even though the EHR kind of disparaged it as not being the whole source of truth, nevertheless, it is our entry point for informatics. And so I think we need to think about how we access data, you know, through the EHR. So, sort of an answer to your question.
Any other questions? Yes, one last question.
So the what are the advantages and disadvantages of using this kind of system compared to the IBM Watson sort of core?
So, you know, I am. So I've more or less been working with IBM Watson for 5 or 6 years now. I am going to take a look at that. They've asked me to take a look at it and see what my impression is of what they've done is. I haven't had the chance yet to see that, so I'm hedging a bit because I may change my mind once I see it. But certainly the press has not been very popular about how kind to the experience at MD Anderson, and my reaction is so far from what I've heard that it's not really artificial intelligence. It's more data gathering, accumulating facts, and then using expert opinion laid on top to render a treatment advice. So for example, that tumor board question. In this situation, what would you do? Well, the data supports this, and expert opinion suggests doing that. So I think it's at that level. And if it does that well, that would be useful. And that's what I need to look at. But it doesn't really have, so far from what I've seen, that artificial intelligence ability to actually mine the data and learn from and structure models. So it may be a different part of IBM Watson is doing that. But the part that I think clinicians have seen doesn't seem to exhibit that.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Peter, for coming.
Where? I do not know. I know I'm having lunch. I do.